The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped downtown law office, casting harsh shadows across stacks of legal briefs and coffee-stained documents. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die slowly, buried under mountains of paperwork. And the weight of bureaucratic indifference. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and disappointment, its worn leather chairs holding the stories of countless people who had come seeking justice, only to leave with empty pockets and heavier hearts. Dolph Lundgren sat in one of those chairs, his massive frame making the furniture look comically small. At 6 feet 5 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of a doorway, he was impossible to ignore. Yet somehow, everyone in that office managed to do exactly that. The receptionists glanced past him as if he were invisible. The junior associates hurried by without making eye contact. Even the cleaning lady seemed to navigate around him with practiced indifference. But Dolph was used to being overlooked in places like this. People saw what they expected to see. A man whose face had been carved by Hollywood makeup artists to look like a villain, whose accent carried the weight of his Swedish homeland, whose very presence seemed to suggest that thinking wasn't his strong suit. They saw the action hero, the destroyer of robots in Rocky IV, the man who had spent decades playing characters whose problems were solved with fists rather than words. What they didn't see was the PhD in chemical engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology. They didn't see the man who had received a Fulbright scholarship to MIT, who spoke 5 languages fluently, who could discuss quantum mechanics as easily as he could throw a punch on screen. They didn't see the careful student of law who had spent the last 3 years buried in legal textbooks, studying case precedents with the same intensity he had once brought to perfecting his fighting techniques. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had portrayed unstoppable forces of nature on screen, reduced to waiting patiently in a law office, while lesser minds dismissed him as just another celebrity trying to play dress-up in the real world. But Dolph had learned patience long ago. Growing up in Stockholm, he had been the tall, awkward kid who got picked on until he discovered martial arts. In Hollywood, he had been the foreign actor who had to fight for every role that wasn't a stereotypical villain. Patience had been his ally then, and it would be his ally now. The case that had brought him here was personal, in ways that cut deeper than any movie role ever could. His younger sister, Aurora Lundgren, had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier. The details were straightforward enough on the surface. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into her vehicle at an intersection in downtown Los Angeles. Aurora had died instantly. The drunk driver, Ethan Wheeler, had walked away with minor injuries and a blood alcohol level that was nearly 3 times the legal limit. What should have been an open and shut case had become a nightmare of legal maneuvering and procedural delays. Wheeler came from money, old California money that could afford the kind of legal representation that specialized in making problems disappear. His attorneys had filed motion after motion, challenging everything from the validity of the breathalyzer test to the timing of the traffic lights. They had managed to get key evidence suppressed, witnesses discredited, and expert testimony excluded. Meanwhile, Aurora's case had been assigned to an overworked public prosecutor who seemed more interested in plea bargaining than pursuing justice. The family's attempts to hire private counsel had been met with astronomical fee estimates and thinly veiled suggestions that they should simply accept whatever settlement was offered and move on with their lives. But Dolph couldn't move on. Aurora hadn't just been his sister. She had been his closest friend, his confidant, the one person who had always seen past the Hollywood facade to the man underneath. She had been a social worker, dedicating her life to helping children who had been abandoned by the system. She had been planning to adopt a little girl named Emma Castro, a 7-year-old who had been bounced between foster homes for most of her young life. The thought of Aurora's killer walking free, of continuing to live his privileged life while she lay in the ground, was something Dolph simply couldn't accept. So he had done what he always did when faced with an impossible challenge. He had educated himself. For 3 years, he had studied law with the same methodical precision he had once applied to learning martial arts or mastering accents for movie roles. The law office where he now sat belonged to a firm called Morrison & Associates, though it was really just Harrison Morrison, a solo practitioner who specialized in what he generously called entertainment law. In reality, Morrison handled the kinds of cases that more prestigious firms wouldn't touch: celebrity divorces, contract disputes with questionable talent agents, and the occasional criminal defense for actors whose careers had taken unfortunate turns. Morrison himself was everything that Hollywood casting would have chosen for the role of a sleazy lawyer. He was short and round, with thinning hair that he combed over in elaborate patterns to hide his expanding bald spot. His suits were expensive but ill-fitting, and he had the kind of artificial smile that suggested he had practiced it in the mirror until it looked almost genuine. When Morrison finally called Dolph into his office, the lawyer didn't bother to look up from the papers scattered across his desk. "Mr. Lundgren," he said, his voice carrying the practiced boredom of someone who dealt with Hollywood egos on a daily basis. "I've reviewed the materials you sent over regarding your sister's case. I have to tell you, this isn't really the kind of thing my firm typically handles." Dolph settled into the chair across from Morrison's desk, his movements careful and controlled despite his size. "I understand this isn't a typical entertainment law matter," he said, his accent giving his words a measured cadence. "But I was hoping you might make an exception given the circumstances." Morrison finally looked up, his expression a mixture of pity and condescension. "Look, I get it. You're angry about what happened to your sister. Anyone would be. But this Wheeler kid has some serious legal firepower backing him up. Jameson, Keller and Associates aren't the kind of lawyers you go up against unless you have serious resources and serious experience." "I have resources," Dolph said quietly. "I'm sure." "You do," Morrison replied, waving a dismissive hand. "But money isn't the only issue here. This is complex litigation against experienced attorneys who know every trick in the book. You need someone who specializes in wrongful death cases, someone who knows how to navigate the system. What you don't need is to throw good money after Ibad on a case that's probably already lost." Dolph leaned forward slightly, his pale blue eyes fixed on Morrison's face. "What if I told you I was willing to take an active role in preparing the case? I've done quite a bit of research into the relevant statutes and precedents." Morrison's laugh was short and sharp. "No offense, Mr. Lundgren, but I'm sure you have better things to do than play paralegal. Leave the legal work to the lawyers and stick to what you know best." The dismissal was casual, automatic, the kind of professional brush-off that Morrison had probably perfected over years of dealing with clients who thought they understood the law because they had watched a few episodes of a legal drama. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested he found the very idea of Dolph Lundgren understanding legal complexities to be genuinely amusing. Dolph sat back in his chair, studying Morrison's face for a long moment. He had encountered this attitude before, in Hollywood boardrooms, where executives assumed that his imposing physical presence meant he couldn't possibly have anything intelligent to contribute. He had learned to navigate those situations with patience and strategic thinking, qualities that had served him well both on screen and off. "I appreciate your honesty," Dolph said finally, "but perhaps you could humor me for just a few minutes. I'd like to walk you through some of the issues I've identified with the prosecution's approach to my sister's case." Morrison glanced at his watch with theatrical obviousness. "Sure, we can do that. You've got 5 minutes." Dolph reached into the leather briefcase he had brought with him and withdrew a thick folder filled with meticulously organized documents. "The first problem," he began, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone who had spent considerable time thinking through complex issues is that the prosecution has been approaching this as a simple DUI case when it should be treated as vehicular manslaughter with aggravating circumstances. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained skeptical. The charges were filed appropriately based on the evidence available. Were they? Dolph asked, pulling out a copy of the police report. According to the initial investigation, Wheeler's blood alcohol level was 0.24, which is nearly 3 times the legal limit. But more importantly, security camera footage from a nearby business shows that he was speeding significantly when he entered the intersection. Speed is always a factor in these cases, Morrison said, though his tone had lost some of its casual dismissiveness. True, Dolph agreed. But the combination of extreme intoxication and excessive speed meets the criteria for gross vehicular manslaughter under California Penal Code Section 191.5. The prosecution chose to file the lesser charge of vehicular manslaughter without gross negligence, which carries a maximum sentence of 6 years instead of 10. Morrison was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against his desk. That's an interesting observation, but charging decisions are made by the prosecutor's office based on their assessment of what they can prove. Which brings me to the second problem, Dolph continued, flipping to another section of his folder. The defense has been successful in getting key evidence suppressed by challenging the chain of custody for the blood sample, but they're relying on a procedural argument that doesn't actually invalidate the test results. And I'm not following, Morrison said, though his posture had shifted slightly, suggesting that he was paying closer attention than his words indicated. Dolph pulled out a case file marked with yellow sticky notes. In People v. Rodriguez, the California Supreme Court ruled that technical violations in chain of custody procedures don't automatically render blood alcohol evidence inadmissible if the integrity of the sample can be established through other means. The prosecution has witnessed testimony from both the responding officer and the hospital technician who drew Wheeler's blood, plus documentation showing that the sample was properly sealed and transported. Morrison leaned forward, his earlier skepticism beginning to give way to genuine interest. You're saying the prosecution could have fought the suppression motion more aggressively. I'm saying they should have cited Rodriguez and at least 6 other relevant precedents that support the admissibility of properly collected blood evidence, even when there are minor procedural irregularities, Dolph replied. Instead, they seemed to accept the defense argument without mounting a serious challenge. For the first time since Dolph had entered the office, Morrison was quiet for more than a few seconds. He picked up one of the documents from Dolph's folder and scanned it carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line he read. This is actually quite thorough, Morrison said slowly. Where did you find these cases? Legal. Databases, primarily Westlaw and Lexis, Dolph replied matter-of-factly. I've also been corresponding with several law professors who specialize in criminal procedure. Professor Grace Freeman at UCLA has been particularly helpful in understanding the nuances of vehicular homicide statutes. Morrison set down the document and looked at Dolph with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and grudging respect. You've really done your homework on this. My sister deserves justice, Dolph said simply. If that means I need to learn enough law to ensure she gets it, then that's what I'll do. The office fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic outside and the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights. Morrison picked up another document from Dolph's folder, this one marked with handwritten notes in the margins. As he read, his expression continued to evolve, moving from skepticism to interest to something approaching professional recognition. You've identified at least 3 separate grounds for appeal if Wheeler's conviction gets overturned, Morrison said. his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "And you've mapped out alternative legal strategies based on different evidentiary scenarios." "I've tried to be thorough," Dolph replied. Morrison looked up from the documents, studying Dolph's face as if seeing him for the first time. "This isn't amateur hour legal research. This is the kind of analysis I'd expect from a third-year law student or a junior associate. How long did you say you've been studying this?" 3 years, Dolph said. "Ever since Aurora was killed." Morrison set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I have to admit, when you first walked in here, I was prepared to give you the standard celebrity brush-off. Rich actor wants to play lawyer, throw some money at the problem, make themselves feel better. But this," he gestured at the documents spread across his desk, "this is serious legal work." "Does that mean you'll take the case?" Dolph asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "It means I'm willing to consider it. But I have to ask, why me? With the kind of preparation you've done, you could walk into any major firm in the city and get their attention." Dolph smiled slightly, the first time his expression had softened since entering the office. "Because you're the only lawyer who was willing to give me 5 minutes to make my case. Everyone else assumed they already knew what I had to say." Morrison laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him. "Fair enough, and you're right about one thing. Your sister's case has been handled poorly from the beginning. If half of what you've outlined here is accurate, there are grounds for serious prosecutorial misconduct allegations." "More than grounds," Dolph said, pulling out another folder. "I've documented at least 14 separate instances where the prosecution failed to pursue available evidence or challenge obviously flawed defense arguments. It's almost as if they wanted to lose." Morrison's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation," Dolph replied. "My sister was killed by a drunk driver from a wealthy family, and the system seems determined to let him walk away with a slap on the wrist. I'm not going to let that happen." The conviction in Dolph's voice was unmistakable, carrying the same intensity that had made him convincing as an action hero, but tempered with the careful precision of someone who had learned to fight with words instead of fists. Morrison found himself nodding slowly, recognizing something in the other man's tone that went beyond grief or anger into the realm of absolute determination. "All right," Morrison said finally. "I'll take the case, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, we do this properly. No shortcuts, no celebrity privileges, no assumptions that your fame will somehow influence the outcome. This is going to be a long, difficult fight against some very expensive lawyers." "Agreed." "Second, you continue the legal research you've been doing, but under my supervision. You've clearly got a talent for this, but talent without experience can be dangerous in a courtroom." "Understood." Morrison picked up the folder containing Dolph's research and hefted it appreciatively. "And third, you need to understand that even with all this preparation, even with the best legal arguments in the world, there's no guarantee we'll get the outcome you want. The system isn't always just, especially when there's serious money involved." Dolph nodded slowly. "I understand the risks, but doing nothing isn't an option." Morrison extended his hand across the desk. "Then welcome to the legal profession, Mr. Lundgren. Let's go get justice for your sister." As Dolph shook Morrison's hand, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the false optimism of someone who expected easy victories, but the quiet confidence of someone who had done the work and was prepared for the fight ahead. Aurora's killer might have money and connections, but Dolph had something potentially more powerful: the truth and the knowledge to present it effectively. The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead, and the waiting room outside still smelled of stale coffee and disappointment. But for the first time since Aurora's death, Dolph felt like he was moving forward instead of simply enduring. The real work was just beginning. The Los Angeles County Superior Court building loomed against the morning sky like a monument to justice. Deferred, its concrete facade, weathered by decades of California sun and the weight of countless legal battles, stood as a testament to the slow, grinding machinery of the American legal system. Inside its sterile corridors, dreams were crushed and vindicated in equal measure, while the marble floors echoed with the footsteps of lawyers, defendants, and families seeking resolution to life's most devastating moments. Dolph Lundgren walked through those corridors with the measured pace of someone who had learned to control both his physical presence and his emotional state. 3 months had passed since his meeting with Harrison Morrison, 3 months of intensive preparation that had transformed him from a grieving brother into something approaching a legal scholar. His briefcase, now a familiar weight in his hand, contained not just the documentation of his sister's case, but hundreds of hours of additional research into vehicular homicide law, prosecutorial misconduct, and the intersection of wealth and justice in the California court system. The preliminary hearing for Ethan Wheeler's case was scheduled for 9 o'clock in Judge Patricia Sullivan's courtroom. Morrison had warned Dolph that preliminary hearings were largely procedural affairs, opportunities for both sides to present their basic arguments and for the judge to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. What Morrison hadn't expected was that Wheeler's defense team would use the hearing as an opportunity to attack the very foundation of the prosecution's case with a level of aggression that suggested they were confident in their ability to make the charges disappear entirely. As Dolph entered courtroom 7B, he was struck by the familiar Hollywood quality of the scene unfolding before him. The defense table was occupied by 3 attorneys from Jameson, Keller, and Associates, each one perfectly groomed and expensively dressed in the manner of lawyers who charged $1,000 an hour and considered it a bargain. At their head sat Marcus Jameson himself, a man whose silver hair and commanding presence had made him a favorite of wealthy defendants throughout Southern California. Ethan Wheeler sat beside his legal team, looking nothing like the reckless, drunk driver who had ended Aurora's life. At 26, he had the kind of clean-cut appearance that money could buy, perfectly styled hair, a custom-tailored suit, and the confident bearing of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. His family occupied the first row behind the defense table, their expensive clothing and practiced expressions of concern suggesting that they were treating this legal proceeding as just another obstacle to be overcome through the application of sufficient resources. On the prosecution side, the contrast was stark. Deputy District Attorney Noah Foster sat alone at his table, surrounded by cardboard boxes of evidence that looked hastily assembled. Foster was young, probably no more than 30, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who was managing too many cases with too few resources. His suit was off the rack, his briefcase was showing signs of wear, and his overall demeanor suggested that he was already resigned to losing this case before it had truly begun. Morrison had secured seats in the gallery for himself and Dolph, close enough to observe the proceedings, but far enough back to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. As they settled into their chairs, Morrison leaned over and whispered, "Remember, this is just the preliminary round. The real fight comes later." But Dolph was focused on something else entirely. In the 3 months since Aurora's death, he had become intimately familiar with every detail of the case file, every piece of evidence, every witness statement. What he was seeing in Foster's preparation suggested that the prosecution was about to make the same mistakes that had plagued the case from the beginning. Judge Patricia Sullivan entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of similar proceedings. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from decades of dealing with lawyers who thought they were cleverer than they actually were. Sullivan had a reputation for fairness, but also for impatience with attorneys who came to her courtroom unprepared. "The People versus Ethan Wheeler," Judge Sullivan announced as she settled behind the bench. "Counsel, please state your appearances for the record." Noah Foster rose from his chair with visible nervousness. Noah Foster, Deputy District Attorney, representing the people of the state of California. Marcus Jameson's response was delivered with the kind of theatrical confidence that came from years of courtroom victories. "Marcus Jameson of Jameson, Keller and Associates, representing Mr. Ethan Wheeler. Also appearing with me today are my associates, Ms. Lillian Bennett and Mr. Leo Griffin." Judge Sullivan nodded and opened the file in front of her. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to bind over the defendant for trial on charges of vehicular manslaughter. Mr. Foster, you may present your case." What followed was a textbook example of prosecutorial inadequacy. Foster's opening statement was brief and unfocused, hitting the basic facts of the case without providing the kind of compelling narrative that would resonate with a judge who had heard similar cases hundreds of times before. He outlined Wheeler's blood alcohol level, the circumstances of the collision, and Aurora's death with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a checklist rather than advocating for justice. When Foster began presenting his evidence, Dolph felt his frustration mounting with each missed opportunity. The prosecution's first witness was Officer James Brady, the responding officer who had arrived at the scene of the accident. Foster's questioning was perfunctory, establishing the basic timeline of events without delving into the details that would make Wheeler's culpability clear and undeniable. "Officer Brady," Foster said, consulting his notes, "can you describe the condition of the defendant when you arrived at the scene?" "The defendant appeared to be intoxicated," Brady replied. "He had bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, and a strong odor of alcohol on his breath." "And did you administer any field sobriety tests?" "I did. Mr. Wheeler failed all 3 standard tests." Foster nodded and moved on to the next topic without exploring the implications of Brady's testimony. He failed to ask about Wheeler's behavior at the scene, his apparent lack of concern for Aurora's condition, or his attempts to use his family's influence to avoid arrest. All of these details were in the police report, but Foster seemed content to present only the most basic facts. When Marcus Jameson rose for cross-examination, the difference in advocacy was immediately apparent. Where Foster had been tentative and mechanical, Jameson was aggressive and precise, attacking every aspect of Brady's testimony with the kind of surgical precision that came from decades of courtroom experience. "Officer Brady," Jameson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, "you've testified that my client appeared intoxicated, but you're not a medical doctor, are you?" "No, sir. And you're not qualified to make medical diagnoses based on visual observation." "I'm trained to recognize the signs of intoxication." "Trained by whom? And when was your last refresher course on identifying intoxication?" Foster should have objected to this line of questioning, but he remained silent as Jameson systematically undermined Brady's credibility. The defense attorney moved through a series of questions designed to suggest that Brady's observations were subjective, unreliable, and tainted by assumptions about Wheeler's guilt. Dolph watched this exchange with growing frustration, his hands clenched in his lap as he saw the prosecution's case being dismantled through simple, aggressive questioning. Morrison noticed his agitation and placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Dolph's attention was focused entirely on the legal malpractice unfolding before him. When Jameson finished his cross-examination, Judge Sullivan looked expectantly at Foster for redirect examination. This was the prosecution's opportunity to rehabilitate their witness and address the defense's attacks on Brady's credibility. Foster rose slowly, consulted his notes for what seemed like an eternity, and then delivered the words that made Dolph's blood run cold. "No further questions, Your Honor." The prosecution's case continued in the same vein for the next hour. Foster called the hospital technician who had drawn Wheeler's blood, but failed to establish the reliability of the chain of custody procedures. He called the emergency room doctor who had treated Aurora, but didn't ask about the severity of her injuries or the immediate cause of death. He presented the breathalyzer results without addressing the defense's procedural challenges. Each witness was subjected to devastating cross-examination by Jameson and his associates, and each time, Foster failed to mount an effective defense of his evidence. It was like watching a master chess player dismantle an amateur, move by calculated move. But it was during the testimony of the accident reconstruction expert that Dolph reached his breaking point. Dr. Emma Ramos was a respected forensic engineer who had analyzed the physical evidence from the crash site. Her conclusions were damaging to Wheeler's case. Based on the damage patterns, skid marks, and debris field, she had determined that Wheeler was traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone when he ran the red light and struck Aurora's vehicle. Foster's examination of Dr. Ramos was competent but uninspired. He established her credentials, walked through her methodology, and presented her conclusions without contextualizing their significance for the judge. When he finished, Judge Sullivan was looking at her watch with barely concealed impatience. Jameson's cross-examination was brutal and effective. He challenged Dr. Ramos's methodology, questioned her assumptions about road conditions, and suggested that her speed calculations were based on incomplete data. But his most devastating attack came when he began questioning the reliability of her measurements. "Dr. Ramos," Jameson said, his voice taking on a tone of scholarly inquiry, "your speed calculations are based on the assumption that both vehicles' braking systems were functioning normally at the time of impact, correct?" "That's correct. But you didn't actually inspect the braking systems of either vehicle, did you? The vehicles were too severely damaged for that level of mechanical inspection. So your conclusions about speed are based on an assumption that may or may not be accurate?" Foster should have objected, should have pointed out that Dr. Ramos had based her calculations on established scientific principles that didn't require perfect mechanical knowledge. Instead, he sat silently as Jameson continued his attack. "And your measurements of the skid marks were taken 3 days after the accident, weren't they?" "Yes, after the roadway had been cleaned and reopened to traffic." "Yes, so it's possible that some evidence relevant to your calculations had been removed or altered by the time you examined the scene." "It's possible, but unlikely." Jameson smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just scored a significant point. "But you can't be certain, can you?" Dr. Ramos hesitated for just a moment, but it was enough. "I can't be absolutely certain, no." Dolph felt something snap inside him as he watched this exchange. Dr. Ramos was a respected expert whose conclusions were based on sound scientific principles, but Foster was allowing Jameson to present her testimony as unreliable speculation. The prosecution was losing a case that should have been a straightforward conviction, and they were losing it through sheer incompetence. When Foster again declined to conduct redirect examination, Dolph could no longer contain himself. He rose from his seat in the gallery, his imposing frame immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "I respectfully request permission to address the court." Judge Sullivan's expression was one of complete surprise. In 30 years on the bench, she had never had a member of the gallery interrupt a proceeding in such a manner. "Sir, you are not counsel of record in this case. Please take your seat." Morrison was tugging frantically at Dolph's jacket, whispering urgent warnings about contempt of court, but Dolph remained standing. "Your Honor, I am Aurora Lundgren's brother. The victim in this case was my sister, and I believe the prosecution is failing to present evidence that is crucial to establishing the defendant's guilt. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as spectators and court personnel tried to process what was happening. Jameson was on his feet immediately, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I move for immediate sanctions against this individual for disrupting these proceedings." Judge Sullivan raised her hand for silence, her expression stern but curious. "Mr. Lundgren, Your Honor. Dolph Lundgren. Mr. Lundgren, I understand that you are emotionally invested in the outcome of this case, but you cannot simply stand up in my courtroom and interrupt the proceedings. You are not a licensed attorney, and you have no standing to address this court." Dolph took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either end his involvement in the case or change its trajectory entirely. "Your Honor, while I am not a licensed attorney, I have been studying the legal issues in this case for 3 months. I believe that the prosecution has failed to present crucial evidence that would establish not only the defendant's guilt, but also the aggravating circumstances that would justify enhanced charges." Judge Sullivan's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Lundgren, what you believe is irrelevant. The prosecution of this case is the responsibility of the district attorney's office, not grieving family members." "But what if the district attorney's office is deliberately sabotaging their own case?" Dolph asked, his voice carrying a note of controlled desperation. "What if there's evidence of prosecutorial misconduct that goes beyond simple incompetence?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Sullivan leaned forward in her chair, studying Dolph's face with the intensity of someone trying to determine whether she was dealing with a grieving brother's delusions or something more serious. "Marcus," Jameson was sputtering with outrage, "Your Honor, these accusations are completely unfounded and highly prejudicial. I demand that this individual be removed from the courtroom immediately." But Judge Sullivan raised her hand again, her attention focused entirely on Dolph. "Mr. Lundgren, you are making very serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Dolph reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "I have documented 14 separate instances where the prosecution has failed to pursue available evidence, challenge obviously flawed defense arguments, or present testimony in a manner consistent with established legal standards. I also have evidence suggesting potential coordination between the prosecution and defense teams." Foster had gone pale, his face showing a mixture of confusion and panic. "Your Honor, I object to these proceedings. This is highly irregular, and I don't understand what's happening here." Judge Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk as she considered her options. Finally, she looked up at Dolph with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and annoyance. "Mr. Lundgren, I'm going to give you exactly 5 minutes to present the most compelling evidence you have of prosecutorial misconduct. If you can't convince me that there are serious issues with the prosecution of this case, I will hold you in contempt of court and have you removed. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor. And I want to be clear. This is not a precedent. You are not establishing any right to participate in these proceedings. This is an extraordinary situation that I am handling in an extraordinary manner." Dolph nodded and opened his folder, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He had spent 3 months preparing for the possibility that he would need to present Aurora's case himself, but he had never imagined it would happen under circumstances quite like these. "Your Honor," he began, his voice taking on the measured cadence he had practiced countless times in Morrison's office. "The prosecution has failed to present evidence that would establish vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence, which carries a significantly higher penalty than the charges currently filed." Judge Sullivan gestured for him to continue. "According to the police report, which the prosecution has in their possession but has not presented, the defendant was observed by multiple witnesses engaging in reckless driving behavior for at least 6 blocks before the collision. He ran 2 red lights, sideswiped a parked car, and nearly struck a pedestrian in a crosswalk. Foster started to object, but Judge Sullivan silenced him with a look. Furthermore, Dolph continued, the prosecution has security camera footage from 3 different businesses showing the defendant's vehicle traveling at excessive speed and driving erratically. This footage has been available since the day after the accident, but it has not been presented to this court. Judge Sullivan's expression was growing more serious with each revelation. Mr. Foster, do you have this evidence? Foster stammered for a moment before responding. Your Honor, we are still reviewing all available evidence and determining what is relevant to our case. The footage shows the defendant's complete disregard for public safety, Dolph said, his voice rising slightly. It shows a pattern of reckless behavior that goes far beyond simple drunk driving. This is evidence of gross negligence that would support enhanced charges and a significantly longer prison sentence. Jameson was on his feet again, his face red with anger. Your Honor, even if such evidence exists, it has not been properly authenticated or admitted into evidence. This entire proceeding is a mockery of legal process, but Judge Sullivan was no longer paying attention to the defense attorney. Her focus was entirely on Foster, and her expression suggested that she was beginning to understand the scope of the prosecution's failures. Mr. Foster, she said, her voice carrying a note of dangerous calm. How long have you had this security camera footage? Your Honor, we've had access to it for approximately 2 months. And why hasn't it been presented? Foster looked like a man who was drowning in his own incompetence. We were still determining its relevance to the charges as filed. Judge Sullivan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of judicial authority. Mr. Foster, you are telling me that you have had evidence of the defendant's reckless driving behavior for 2 months, and you determined that it wasn't relevant to a vehicular manslaughter case? The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud. Dolph could see that he had Judge Sullivan's complete attention, and he pressed his advantage. Your Honor, that's just the beginning. The prosecution also has witness testimony from Harper Fleming, a trauma surgeon who was off duty and witnessed the entire accident. Dr. Fleming observed the defendant exit his vehicle immediately after the collision and attempt to dispose of an open container of alcohol. This evidence has also not been presented. Foster looked like he was about to be sick. Your Honor, that witness statement is still being verified. For 3 months? Judge Sullivan asked, her voice rising. There were complications with the witness's schedule. Dolph pulled another document from his folder. Dr. Fleming provided a sworn statement to the police the day after the accident. She has been available for testimony since that time. The prosecution has made no attempt to contact her. Judge Sullivan was staring at Foster with an expression of complete disbelief. Mr. Foster, are you telling me that you have an eyewitness to the defendant's post-accident behavior, and you haven't bothered to interview her? Your Honor, there were resource constraints and... Resource constraints? Judge Sullivan's voice was approaching a roar. A young woman is dead, and you're talking about resource constraints? The courtroom had taken on the atmosphere of a public execution, with Foster as the condemned man and Judge Sullivan as the executioner. But Dolph wasn't finished. Your Honor, there's one more thing. The prosecution has evidence that the defendant used his cell phone to call his father immediately after the accident, before calling for emergency medical assistance. The phone records show that this call lasted approximately 4 minutes, during which time my sister was dying in her vehicle. This revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Even Jameson seemed stunned by the implications of what Dolph was saying. The phone records show that the defendant's second call was to his family's attorney, not to 911, Dolph continued. Emergency services were eventually called by a passing motorist, not by the person responsible for the accident. Judge Sullivan was no longer trying to hide her anger. "Mr. Foster, do you have these phone records?" Foster's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you didn't think that evidence of the defendant's complete lack of concern for the victim was relevant to this case?" We were... You were what, Mr. Foster?" Foster had no answer. He stood at his table like a man facing a firing squad, his career and his case crumbling around him in real time. Judge Sullivan looked at Dolph with an expression that had evolved from skepticism to grudging respect to something approaching admiration. "Mr. Lundgren, in 30 years on this bench, I have never seen anything quite like what you've just presented. You've identified more substantive evidence in 5 minutes than the prosecution has presented in this entire hearing." She turned back to Foster, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Mr. Foster, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Is there any legitimate reason why this evidence has not been presented to this court?" Foster looked around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Finally, he met Judge Sullivan's gaze and gave the only answer he could. "No, Your Honor, there is no legitimate reason." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. Judge Sullivan pounded her gavel for order, but the damage was done. The prosecution's case had been exposed as either grossly incompetent or deliberately sabotaged, and everyone in the room understood the implications. But as Dolph looked around the courtroom, taking in the stunned faces of the spectators and the barely contained rage of the defense team, he realized that his 5 minutes of legal argument had accomplished something he hadn't expected. He had not only exposed the prosecution's failures, he had demonstrated a level of legal knowledge and courtroom presence that no one in the room had anticipated. Judge Sullivan was studying him with an expression of curiosity mixed with something that might have been professional recognition. Morrison was staring at him with his mouth slightly open, as if seeing him for the first time. Even Jameson seemed to be reassessing the man he had dismissed as just another grieving family member. The preliminary hearing was far from over, but the dynamics in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The question was no longer whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The question was whether the prosecution would be allowed to continue handling the case and whether Dolph Lundgren had just announced himself as a legal force that could no longer be ignored. Judge Sullivan picked up her gavel and looked around the silent courtroom. "This hearing is recessed for 1 hour. When we reconvene, I expect both sides to be prepared to address the serious issues that have been raised here today." As the courtroom began to empty, Dolph remained standing at his place in the gallery, his briefcase still open, his folder of evidence still in his hands. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenged the system in a way that would have consequences he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time since Aurora's death, he felt like he was fighting for her instead of simply mourning her. The real battle was just beginning. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with the kind of subdued energy that followed a courtroom earthquake. Word of the morning's events had spread through the building with the speed of legal gossip, and every conversation seemed to center on the same impossible story. A Hollywood action star had just dismantled a prosecutor's case with the precision of a seasoned trial attorney. Dolph sat alone at a corner table, his untouched coffee growing cold as he reviewed his notes for the afternoon session. The past hour had been a whirlwind of hurried conversations with Morrison, frantic phone calls to witnesses, and the dawning realization that his impromptu legal argument had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his sister's case. What had begun as a simple preliminary hearing had become something unprecedented, a public examination of prosecutorial misconduct that threatened to expose corruption reaching far beyond a single DUI case. Morrison approached the table with 2 fresh cups of coffee and the expression of a man trying to process something that defied his understanding of how the world worked. "I've been practicing law for 22 years, he said as he settled into the chair across from Dolph, "and I have never seen anything like what happened in that courtroom." Judge Sullivan seemed receptive to the evidence, Dolph replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Receptive?" Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. She looked like she wanted to hold Foster in contempt and have him disbarred before lunch. "And the way she was looking at you, I've seen judges show respect to senior partners at major firms, but I've never seen one treat a non-lawyer with that level of professional recognition." Dolph glanced around the cafeteria, noting the surreptitious stares and whispered conversations that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "I simply presented the evidence that the prosecution should have presented months ago." "You did more than that," Morrison said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "You demonstrated a level of legal analysis that most attorneys would struggle to match. Where did you learn to present an argument like that?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond simple curiosity. Dolph had been asking himself the same question, trying to understand how 3 months of intensive study had prepared him for a moment that had felt as natural as stepping in front of a movie camera. "I've always been good at absorbing information quickly," he said finally. "When I was preparing for roles, I would spend months studying the character, the time period, the technical details of whatever world I was entering. The law is just another system to understand." Morrison shook his head slowly. "No, it's more than that. I've seen actors prepare for legal roles, and I've seen wealthy clients try to understand their cases. What you did in there was different. You understood not just the facts, but how to present them strategically. You knew exactly which points would resonate with Judge Sullivan, and you delivered them with perfect timing." Before Dolph could respond, a familiar voice interrupted their conversation. "Mr. Lundgren, could I have a word?" They looked up to see Deputy District Attorney Ella Vincent standing beside their table. Vincent was older than Foster, probably, in her late 40s, with the kind of steady presence that suggested she had been handling serious cases for decades. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was viewing Dolph with a mixture of professional respect and cautious curiosity. "Miss Vincent," Morrison said, rising slightly from his chair, "I didn't expect to see you here. I'm here because what happened in that courtroom this morning has raised some serious questions about how this case has been handled." Vincent replied, her attention focused entirely on Dolph. "Questions that go beyond prosecutorial incompetence into areas that could have significant implications for the entire district attorney's office." Dolph gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us." Vincent sat down and spent a moment studying Dolph's face before speaking. "Mr. Lundgren, I've reviewed the evidence you presented this morning, and I've had some very interesting conversations with my superiors about Noah Foster's handling of your sister's case." "And?" Dolph asked. "And it appears that Mr. Foster may have been receiving guidance from sources outside the district attorney's office regarding which evidence to present and which to suppress." The implications of this statement hit Morrison like a physical blow. "You're saying Foster was deliberately sabotaging the case?" "I'm saying that his actions appear to be inconsistent with normal prosecutorial procedure, and that someone may have been influencing his decisions in ways that favored the defense," Vincent replied carefully. "The question is whether you're prepared to help us prove it." Dolph leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the possibilities. "What exactly are you asking?" I'm asking whether you would be willing to serve as a special consultant to our office while we investigate potential misconduct in the prosecution of this case," Vincent said. "Your research has already uncovered more substantive evidence than our own investigators have managed to find in 3 months. We need someone with your analytical skills to help us understand what went wrong and how to fix it." Morrison looked like he was struggling to keep up with the conversation. "You're offering him a consulting position with the district attorney's office?" "I'm offering him an opportunity to ensure that his sister's killer faces appropriate charges based on all available evidence," Vincent replied. "And I'm offering him a chance to help us determine whether there are other cases that have been similarly compromised." The offer was tempting, but Dolph found himself thinking about the broader implications. "Ms. Vincent, what makes you think I'm qualified for this kind of work?" Vincent smiled for the first time since joining their conversation. "Mr. Lundgren, in the space of 5 minutes, you identified evidence that exposed 3 months of prosecutorial failure. You presented legal arguments that left a veteran judge questioning everything she thought she knew about this case. And you did it with the kind of clarity and precision that I'd expect from a senior prosecutor." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But more importantly, you're not part of the system that allowed this misconduct to occur. You're not beholden to political considerations or professional relationships that might compromise your judgment. You have something that's increasingly rare in criminal justice: pure motivation for finding the truth." Dolph was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of accepting Vincent's offer. On one hand, it would give him the resources and authority to pursue Aurora's case with the full power of the district attorney's office behind him. On the other hand, it would thrust him into a world where his unconventional background and methods might not be welcomed by career prosecutors who had spent years climbing the professional ladder. "If I were to accept this position," he said finally, "what would my responsibilities be?" "You would work directly with me to review all evidence in your sister's case and prepare for trial under the appropriate charges," Vincent replied. "You would also assist in our investigation of Foster's conduct and any other cases that may have been similarly compromised." Morrison was shaking his head in disbelief. "This is unprecedented. I don't think there's any legal precedent for a non-attorney serving in this kind of consulting role." "There's no precedent for a lot of what's happened today," Vincent said, "but Judge Sullivan has already indicated that she's willing to consider extraordinary measures to ensure that justice is served in this case. I believe she would approve Mr. Lundgren's participation if it leads to a more competent prosecution." Dolph found himself thinking about Aurora, about the little girl she had planned to adopt, about all the other victims whose cases might have been compromised by prosecutorial misconduct. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. "I accept," he said simply. Vincent nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Your first assignment is to present your complete analysis of the evidence to Judge Sullivan when court reconvenes. I want you to walk her through every piece of evidence that Foster failed to present, and I want you to explain why each piece is crucial to establishing the appropriate charges." As they prepared to return to the courtroom, Morrison pulled Dolph aside. "Are you sure about this? You're about to step into a world where everyone will be watching you, waiting for you to fail." "I've been in that world before," Dolph replied. "The only difference is that this time, failure isn't just bad reviews and disappointed producers. This time, failure means Aurora's killer walks free." The afternoon session began with Judge Sullivan calling both sides to approach the bench. Her expression suggested that the morning's revelations had fundamentally altered her view of the case, and that she was prepared to take extraordinary measures to ensure that justice was served. "Counsel," she began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench, have spent the lunch recess reviewing the evidence presented by Mr. Lundgren, and I have some serious concerns about the prosecution of this case. Foster looked like a man facing his own execution. Jameson, meanwhile, was clearly calculating how to turn the morning's chaos to his client's advantage. "Your Honor," Jameson said, "while I sympathize with Mr. Lundgren's loss, his interruption of these proceedings was highly irregular and prejudicial to my client's rights. I move for dismissal of all charges based on prosecutorial misconduct." Judge Sullivan's laugh was short and sharp. "Mr. Jameson, you're arguing that prosecutorial misconduct that favored your client somehow violated his rights? That's an interesting legal theory." Before Jameson could respond, Vincent rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the District Attorney's Office has conducted a preliminary review of this case, and we are prepared to present a motion to amend the charges based on evidence that was previously suppressed or ignored." "What kind of amendments are we talking about, Ms. Vincent?" "We are seeking to amend the charges to vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence, based on evidence of the defendant's reckless driving behavior prior to the collision," Vincent replied. "We are also seeking to add charges of tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice based on the defendant's post-accident conduct." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the implications of these new charges became clear. Vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison, and the additional charges could add several more years to Wheeler's potential sentence. Jameson was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to inflate charges based on evidence that has not been properly authenticated or admitted. I object to this entire proceeding." Judge Sullivan silenced him with a look. "Mr. Jameson, your client is accused of killing a young woman while driving drunk at twice the speed limit. I'm less concerned with procedural niceties than I am with ensuring that justice is served." She turned to Vincent. "Ms. Vincent, I understand that Mr. Lundgren will be assisting in the presentation of this evidence?" "That's correct, Your Honor. Mr. Lundgren has conducted extensive research into this case, and his analysis has revealed evidence that was not previously presented to this court." Judge Sullivan nodded slowly. "Mr. Lundgren, please approach the bench." Dolph rose from his seat in the gallery and walked to the front of the courtroom, aware that every eye was following his movement. As he stood before Judge Sullivan's bench, he felt the weight of the moment settling around him like a familiar costume. "Mr. Lundgren," Judge Sullivan said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity, "I want to be clear about what's happening here. You are not a licensed attorney, and you cannot formally represent the prosecution in this case. However, you have demonstrated a level of legal knowledge that suggests you may be able to assist the court in understanding complex evidence." "I understand, Your Honor. I am therefore going to allow you to present evidence and analysis to this court under the supervision of Ms. Vincent and subject to the same rules of evidence that would apply to any attorney. Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Sullivan leaned back in her chair, studying Dolph's face. "Mr. Lundgren, I have to ask, where did you acquire the legal knowledge you demonstrated this morning?" "I've been studying the law for 3 years, Your Honor, initially to understand my sister's case, but eventually because I found it intellectually challenging." "And who supervised this study?" "Initially, I worked alone with legal databases and textbooks. Over the past 6 months, I've been corresponding with several law professors who have provided guidance on complex issues." Judge Sullivan nodded slowly. "I see. And you believe you understand the legal standards that apply to the charges being considered?" "I believe I understand the elements that must be proven to establish vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence under California Penal Code Section 191.5, Dolph replied. I also understand the evidentiary requirements for proving consciousness of guilt based on post-offense conduct. Very well, Ms. Vincent, you may proceed with your presentation. What followed was unlike anything anyone in the courtroom had ever witnessed. Vincent began by outlining the legal framework for the amended charges, but it was Dolph who provided the detailed analysis that transformed abstract legal concepts into a compelling narrative of Wheeler's culpability. Working from his meticulously organized files, Dolph walked Judge Sullivan through the security camera footage that showed Wheeler's vehicle weaving through traffic at excessive speed, running red lights, and nearly striking pedestrians in the 6 blocks leading up to the collision. He explained how this evidence established a pattern of gross negligence that went far beyond simple intoxication. "Your Honor," he said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had spent months thinking through these issues. "The defendant's blood alcohol level of 0.24 is certainly evidence of impairment, but it's the totality of his conduct that establishes gross negligence under the statutory definition." He turned to a diagram he had prepared showing the accident scene. "The physical evidence indicates that the defendant was traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour when he struck my sister's vehicle, but the security footage shows that he had been driving recklessly for several minutes before the collision, suggesting that his dangerous conduct was not simply a momentary lapse in judgment." Judge Sullivan was following his analysis with obvious interest. "And you believe this evidence supports the enhanced charges?" "I believe it supports the conclusion that the defendant acted with conscious disregard for human life," Dolph replied. "The gross negligence standard requires proof that the defendant's conduct was more than ordinarily careless. A person who drives drunk at twice the speed limit through multiple red lights in a densely populated area has demonstrated the kind of extreme indifference to human life that the statute was designed to address." But it was when Dolph began presenting evidence of Wheeler's post-accident conduct that the true scope of his legal preparation became apparent. He had obtained phone records, witness statements, and security footage that painted a picture of a defendant who was more concerned with avoiding consequences than helping his victim. The phone records show that within 2 minutes of the collision, the defendant called his father, Dolph explained, consulting his notes. This call lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. His second call, lasting 6 minutes and 32 seconds, was to his family's attorney. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. During these 10 minutes and 49 seconds, the defendant made no attempt to render aid to my sister, who was trapped in her vehicle and still alive. Emergency services were eventually called by a passing motorist, not by the person responsible for the accident. Judge Sullivan's expression was one of barely controlled anger. "And you believe this evidence supports charges of obstruction of justice?" "I believe it supports the conclusion that the defendant attempted to impede the investigation into his criminal conduct," Dolph replied. Witness Harper Fleming observed the defendant attempting to dispose of an open container of alcohol while talking on his phone. This constitutes tampering with evidence under Penal Code Section 141. Jameson had been objecting throughout Dolph's presentation, but Judge Sullivan had overruled him at every turn. The defense attorney's strategy seemed to be focused on attacking Dolph's qualifications rather than addressing the substance of his evidence. "Your Honor," Jameson said during one of his objections, "this entire proceeding is a mockery of legal process. Mr. Lundgren is not qualified to present legal arguments or interpret evidence. He's an actor, not an attorney." Judge Sullivan's response was sharp and definitive. "Mr. Jameson, Mr. Lundgren has presented more substantive legal analysis in the past hour than I've seen in some cases that went to trial. His lack of formal legal credentials doesn't diminish the validity of the evidence he's presenting." She turned to Dolph with an expression that had evolved from skepticism to something approaching professional respect. Mr. Lundgren, in my experience, the ability to analyze complex evidence and present it clearly is not limited to licensed attorneys. You've demonstrated both skills admirably. When Dolph finished his presentation, the courtroom was silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the soft scratch of court reporters' fingers across their keyboards. He'd spent nearly 2 hours walking Judge Sullivan through evidence that painted an undeniable picture of Wheeler's guilt, not just for vehicular manslaughter, but for a pattern of reckless conduct that showed complete disregard for human life. Judge Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the documents and photographs spread across her bench. Finally, she looked up and delivered the words that would change the trajectory of the case forever. Based on the evidence presented today, I find that there is probable cause to believe that the defendant committed vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence, as well as tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. The case will be bound over for trial on all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests. Wheeler's family looked stunned, while Jameson appeared to be calculating his next move in what had suddenly become a much more serious case. But Judge Sullivan wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into the prosecutorial conduct in this case. Ms. Vincent, I want a full report on how evidence of this significance was overlooked or suppressed. She turned to Dolph, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Lundgren, I want to thank you for bringing this evidence to the court's attention. Your presentation was thorough, professional, and compelling. As the courtroom began to empty, Dolph remained at the prosecution table, organizing his files with the same methodical precision he had always brought to his work. Vincent approached him with an expression of amazement, mixed with something that might have been professional admiration. That was extraordinary, she said quietly. I've seen senior prosecutors with decades of experience who couldn't have presented that evidence as effectively as you just did. Morrison joined them, shaking his head in disbelief. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this was all some kind of fever dream. You just successfully prosecuted a preliminary hearing without being a lawyer. Dolph looked around the now empty courtroom, taking in the scene where he had just accomplished something that had seemed impossible 3 months earlier. I didn't prosecute anything, he said finally. I just presented the truth about what happened to my sister, but even as he spoke, he could feel that something fundamental had changed. The careful preparation, the strategic thinking, the ability to present complex arguments clearly and persuasively. These skills felt as natural to him as stepping in front of a camera or throwing a punch in a fight scene. Vincent was studying him with the expression of someone who was seeing possibilities that hadn't existed an hour earlier. Mr. Lundgren, I have a proposition for you. Another consulting arrangement? Something more significant than that, she replied. Have you ever considered law school? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond Aurora's case. Dolph found himself thinking about the past 3 years, about the countless hours he had spent studying legal principles that had started as a necessity and evolved into something approaching passion. Law school? He repeated. You have the analytical skills, the research ability, and the courtroom presence, Vincent said. With your background and the knowledge you've already acquired, you could complete a law degree in 3 years and be practicing criminal law by the time you're 50. Morrison was nodding enthusiastically. She's right. I've seen law school, graduates who couldn't do what you did today. Dolph was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Aurora, about justice, about the possibility of spending the rest of his life fighting for victims who couldn't fight for themselves. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, a complete departure from everything he had planned for his future. I'll think about it, he said finally. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Dolph found himself looking at the building differently than he had that morning. When he had arrived, it had seemed like a monument to bureaucratic indifference. Now it looked like something else entirely. A place where truth could triumph over wealth and influence, where careful preparation and passionate advocacy could change the course of justice. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, and Dolph paused for a moment to look back at the building where he had just discovered something about himself that he hadn't known existed. The man who had entered that morning as a grieving brother seeking justice had emerged as something unexpected, a legal advocate with the skills and determination to fight for victims who had been failed by the system. Wheeler's trial was still months away, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. More importantly, Dolph had found something he hadn't been looking for, a new purpose that felt as compelling as any role he had ever played, and infinitely more meaningful. As he walked away from the courthouse, he was already thinking about law school applications, about the LSAT, about the possibility of trading Hollywood sound stages for courtrooms where real justice was at stake. The transformation that had begun 3 months earlier with a grief-stricken brother's determination to understand his sister's case had become something larger, the birth of an advocate who would spend the rest of his life ensuring that Aurora's death had not been in vain. The legal world had gained an unlikely new warrior, and the implications of that change were only beginning to unfold. 6 months later, the same courthouse that had witnessed Dolph Lundgren's unlikely legal debut was as packed to capacity for what had become the most closely watched criminal trial in Los Angeles County. The case of People v. Wheeler had attracted national attention, not just because of the defendant's wealthy family or the tragic circumstances of Aurora Lundgren's death, but because of the extraordinary role played by her brother in bringing the case to trial. The media had dubbed it the action hero's legal thriller, but those who had followed the case closely understood that the real story was far more complex than any Hollywood script. What had begun as a simple drunk driving case had evolved into a landmark prosecution that had exposed systemic corruption in the district attorney's office and established new precedents for victim family involvement in criminal proceedings. Dolph sat in the front row of the gallery, his presence now as familiar in this courtroom as it had once been on movie screens around the world. Over the past 6 months, he had become something unprecedented in the American legal system, a non-attorney who had been granted special status to assist in the prosecution of his sister's killer. His legal research had formed the foundation of the state's case. His analysis had guided the prosecution strategy, and his courtroom presentations had helped convince Judge Sullivan that justice demanded more than the plea bargain that Wheeler's attorneys had initially sought. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The man who had stumbled into legal advocacy through grief and determination had become a student of the law with an intensity that surprised even his closest supporters. He had enrolled in night law school at UCLA, maintaining a perfect grade, point average, while simultaneously working on Aurora's case. His professors spoke of him with the kind of respect typically reserved for their most brilliant students, though they also noted that his approach to legal study was unlike anything they had encountered, where traditional law students focused on memorizing case law and legal principles. Dolph approached the law like a scientist studying a complex system. He didn't just learn the rules. He understood their underlying logic and their practical applications. He could see patterns and connections that escaped more conventionally trained minds, and he had developed an ability to present complex legal arguments with a clarity that made them accessible to judges and juries alike. The trial itself had been a masterclass in criminal prosecution. Ella Vincent had led the state's case with the skill of a veteran prosecutor, but it was Dolph's research and analysis that had provided the foundation for their strategy. Together, they had constructed a narrative that went beyond simple drunk, driving to reveal Wheeler as someone whose privileged background had taught him that consequences were for other people. The evidence they presented painted a devastating picture of the defendant's conduct. Security camera footage showed Wheeler's vehicle weaving through traffic at dangerous speeds, running red lights and nearly striking pedestrians in the minutes before the collision. Witness testimony revealed a pattern of reckless behavior that stretched back years, including previous incidents of drunk driving that had been covered up by his family's influence. But it was the evidence of Wheeler's post-accident conduct that had proven most damaging to his case. The phone records that Dolph had uncovered showed the defendant's priorities with stark clarity. Protect himself first, worry about his victim later. The testimony of Dr. Harper Fleming, the trauma surgeon who had witnessed Wheeler attempting to dispose of evidence while Aurora lay dying in her vehicle, had brought several jurors to tears. Throughout the trial, Dolph had maintained his unique role as both victim family member and prosecution consultant. Judge Sullivan had allowed him to present evidence and analysis to the court, though always under Vincent's supervision and subject to the same rules that governed licensed attorneys. His presentations had been models of legal advocacy, thorough, logical, and emotionally compelling, without being manipulative. The defense had struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt. Marcus Jameson and his team had fallen back on familiar strategies, attacking the credibility of witnesses, challenging the admissibility of evidence, and arguing that Wheeler's privileged background somehow mitigated his culpability. But their arguments had seemed increasingly desperate, as the prosecution had methodically dismantled every aspect of their case. Jameson had also tried repeatedly to exclude Dolph from the proceedings, arguing that his participation was prejudicial and unprecedented. But Judge Sullivan had consistently ruled in favor of allowing his involvement, noting that his legal analysis was substantive and his courtroom demeanor was professional. Mr. Lundgren has demonstrated a level of legal competence that would be creditable in any licensed attorney, she had said during one particularly heated exchange. The court sees no reason to exclude him simply because he lacks formal credentials. The trial had also become a showcase for prosecutorial reform. The investigation into Noah Foster's conduct had revealed a pattern of cases where evidence had been suppressed or ignored, particularly when defendants came from wealthy families. Foster had eventually resigned from the district attorney's office and was facing possible disbarment proceedings. His replacement had implemented new protocols designed to prevent similar misconduct in the future. Now, as closing arguments concluded and the jury began their deliberations, Dolph found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months earlier, he had been a grieving brother seeking justice for his sister. Today, he was a law student who had helped prosecute one of the most significant criminal cases in recent California history. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. The entertainment industry had struggled to understand his new direction, with some colleagues suggesting that his legal pursuits were a form of midlife crisis or an elaborate publicity stunt. But Dolph had discovered something in the law that he had never found in Hollywood: the ability to create real change in the world, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. His law school professors had been equally surprised by his commitment to his studies. Professor Grace Freeman, who taught criminal procedure, had initially been skeptical of having a celebrity student in her classroom. But Dolph's performance had quickly dispelled any concerns about special treatment or divided attention. He approaches legal study with an intensity I've rarely seen, Professor Freeman had told a reporter who was writing about Dolph's academic pursuits. He doesn't just want to understand the law, he wants to understand how it can be used most effectively to achieve justice. That's a perspective that some students never develop, even after years of practice. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days, longer than anyone had expected given the strength of the evidence. Vincent had warned Dolph that extended deliberations could indicate disagreement among the jurors, possibly suggesting that Wheeler's expensive defense team had succeeded in creating reasonable doubt about some aspects of the case. But Dolph remained confident in the prosecution they had presented. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal arguments were sound, and the narrative they had constructed was both compelling and truthful. If the jury was taking time to deliberate, it was probably because they were being thorough in their consideration of the evidence, not because they doubted Wheeler's guilt. As he sat in the courthouse cafeteria during the 3rd day of deliberations, Dolph was approached by a woman he didn't immediately recognize. She was probably in her 30s, with the kind of professional bearing that suggested she worked in the legal system. "Mr. Lundgren," she said tentatively, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Camilla Morris, and I'm a public defender here in Los Angeles." Dolph rose and shook her hand. "Ms. Morris, how can I help you?" "I've been following your case, and I wanted to thank you for what you've done," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "Not just for your sister, but for all the victims whose cases have been mishandled by prosecutorial misconduct." "I appreciate that, but I was just trying to get justice for Aurora." Morris shook her head. "You did much more than that. The investigation that your case triggered has led to reviews of dozens of other cases. 3 convictions have already been overturned because of evidence that was improperly suppressed, and several families are finally getting the justice they deserved." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for what she wanted to say next. "I also wanted to ask you something. Have you thought about what you want to do after law school?" "I'm still focused on getting through law school," Dolph replied with a slight smile. "I understand, but I hope you'll consider public interest law," Morris said. "We need advocates who understand that the law isn't just an intellectual exercise, that it has real consequences for real people. What you've done in this case shows that you have the skills and the passion to make a real difference." Before Dolph could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message from Vincent. "Jury is back. Verdict in 30 minutes." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Sullivan called the proceedings to order. Representatives from the media occupied every available seat, while overflow crowds gathered in the hallway outside. The case had captured public attention in ways that went beyond typical celebrity involvement, becoming a symbol of whether wealth and privilege could still purchase immunity from consequences. Wheeler sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys, his earlier confidence replaced by the pallor of someone who had finally begun to understand that his family's money might not be enough to save him. His parents occupied the front row behind the defense table, their expressions a mixture of defiance and growing desperation. On the prosecution side, Vincent looked calm and professional, the bearing of someone who had done everything possible to present a compelling case. Dolph sat in his usual place in the gallery, his expression neutral, despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Judge Sullivan entered the courtroom with her characteristic brisk efficiency, though today her expression seemed more solemn than usual. She had presided over this case from its chaotic beginning through its methodical prosecution, and she understood better than anyone the broader implications of the verdict that was about to be delivered. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, after settling behind the bench, "I understand that you have reached a verdict in this case." The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who had listened to 6 weeks of testimony with careful attention, rose from his seat. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. How do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps. Wheeler's mother began sobbing openly, while his father stared straight ahead with the expression of someone who had just watched his carefully constructed world collapse. But Judge Sullivan wasn't finished. On the charge of tampering with evidence, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. The verdict was unanimous on all counts, a complete vindication of the prosecution's case and a repudiation of the defense team's attempts to minimize Wheeler's culpability. As the judge polled each juror individually, confirming their agreement with the verdict, Dolph felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Aurora's killer had been held accountable. The system that had initially failed her had ultimately delivered justice. The months of study, the courtroom battles, the transformation from grieving brother to legal advocate had all led to this moment of vindication. Judge Sullivan scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she took a moment to address the unusual circumstances that had brought the case to this point. This case has been notable not just for the serious crimes committed by the defendant, but for the extraordinary advocacy demonstrated by the victim's family. She looked directly at Dolph. Mr. Lundgren, your dedication to seeking justice for your sister has been remarkable. Your legal research and analysis have been instrumental in bringing this case to a successful conclusion, and your conduct throughout these proceedings has been exemplary. She paused, her expression thoughtful. I hope that other victim families will be inspired by your example, and that the legal system will find ways to better incorporate their voices in the pursuit of justice. As the courtroom began to empty, Dolph remained in his seat, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Vincent approached him with tears in her eyes, her professional composure finally giving way to the emotion of the moment. "We did it," she said quietly. "Aurora got justice." "Yes, she did," Dolph replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And hopefully this case will help other families get justice too." Morrison joined them, his expression one of amazement mixed with professional pride. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said. "You've got a year and a half left in law school, and then you'll be eligible to take the bar exam. Have you thought about what kind of law you want to practice?" Dolph was quiet for a moment, thinking about the conversation with Camilla Morris, about the families who had been failed by prosecutorial misconduct, about the little girl Aurora had planned to adopt, who was still waiting for a permanent home. "I want to help people who can't help themselves," he said finally. "Victims' families, people who've been failed by the system, anyone who needs an advocate but can't afford the kind of representation that wealth can buy." Vincent nodded with approval. "The district attorney's office would be honored to have you as a prosecutor once you're licensed. And if you decide to go into private practice, Morrison and Associates would be proud to have you as a partner," Morrison added. But Dolph was thinking about something different entirely. "Actually, I've been considering starting a legal clinic specifically focused on victim advocacy. Something that would provide free legal services to families who've been failed by the system." The idea had been forming in his mind throughout the trial, inspired by the stories of other families whose cases had been mishandled. There were people throughout the country who needed the kind of intensive legal advocacy that had made Aurora's case successful, but who lacked the resources or knowledge to pursue it. "That's an interesting idea," Vincent said thoughtfully. "You'd need funding, staff, office space. I have some resources from my acting career," Dolph replied. "And I think there are people who would support this kind of work if they understood how much difference it could make." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Dolph found himself looking at the building with the same sense of possibility he had felt months earlier. But now it was coupled with something new, a clear vision of how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. The media was waiting outside, cameras and microphones thrust forward as reporters shouted questions about the verdict and Dolph's future plans. He paused on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd of journalists and the larger crowd of supporters who had gathered to hear the outcome of the trial. "Today, justice was served for my sister Aurora," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courthouse plaza. "But this case has also shown me that there are too many families who don't get justice, who are failed by a system that should protect them." He paused, thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. "I'm going to finish law school, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my life fighting for those families." Aurora's death was a tragedy that can't be undone, but it can serve as a catalyst for change that helps other victims get the justice they deserve. As the questions continued and the cameras flashed, Dolph felt a sense of purpose that was deeper and more satisfying than anything he had experienced in Hollywood. The action hero had found a new role, one that didn't require scripts or special effects, but offered something infinitely more meaningful: the opportunity to be a real hero for people who needed one. The legal world had gained an unlikely advocate, and the implications of that change would be felt for years to come. Aurora's legacy would live on, not just in the justice that had been achieved for her death, but in the countless other victims who would benefit from her brother's newfound calling. 3 years later, the Lundgren Legal Clinic would open its doors in downtown Los Angeles, offering free legal services to victim families and becoming a model for similar programs across the country. Dolph would pass the California bar exam on his first attempt, earning one of the highest scores in the state's history. He would go on to handle cases that would establish new precedents for victim advocacy and prosecutorial accountability. But all of that was still in the future. Today, standing on the courthouse steps where he had first discovered his calling, Dolph Lundgren was simply a brother who had kept his promise to his sister. Justice had been served, and a new chapter in the fight for victims' rights was about to begin. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.